The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Protecting Your Network with Authentication and Cryptography. My name is Michelle and I'll be helping with today's session. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today. Debbie Dahlen is a security expert and global knowledge instructor who has been providing technical solutions and training since 1975. We're so happy you're here, Debbie. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Michelle. It's really important as we establish how to protect our network's communication with authentication and cryptography that it's insufficient to have just one of those. We have to have both. The focus of this particular session is mostly going to be on the aspect of having strong authentication. But if you don't follow strong authentication with strong encryption, anyone could still bump a victim off that communication channel and take it over in what we would call hijacking, or even join in along with them in a form of sidejacking. So while we are focused on authentication, keep in mind it has to be followed then with appropriate encryption. This gives credence to the term crypto system, where we're bringing together the appropriate levels of both. And as you establish the means of using whichever type of authentication and encryption you are going to choose, it will also be important that you do it at the right layer of the OSI or TCP/IP model. Here again, there's always that conversation of, well, why do we talk OSI? Because we really use TCP/IP. It's much more granular to talk about the OSI model. So as I talk about layers, it truly would be within the TCP/IP stack. But just realize that strong authentication aside, we can authenticate at different layers just as we can provide encryption at different layers. So stepping back to the aspect of authentication, notice our focus here is to provide assurance as to who's on the other end of this channel that you're communicating across. Part of the problem that we have with authentication is there's so many protocols out there, and a protocol is just a means to communicate. So often within a protocol we have other protocols. And when people are trying to check the box, yep, I've got strong authentication, they do things like, oh, gee, got Kerberos, check it off. And yet Kerberos is focusing on single sign-on, not on strong authentication. So as we focus on authentication, it's going to be what are the different protocols that bring together a complete solution. And keep in mind that the solution we spell out may not be appropriate for your organization. That's where you can pick and choose which pieces you want. But you need to be sure that you're picking the pieces based on what they really do, and not just on the fact that it was a cute little buzzword you read in a magazine and therefore you're happy it's going to satisfy your requirement. Again, following then that authentication with encryption will help prevent the hijacking and help eliminate the threat of eavesdropping. As I said with authentication, it is the assurance of who's on the other end. Therefore, it needs to be a validation of some type of credential. Normally, we refer to this as having supplied an identity, like a username, and then when you validate the credential, we call the process authentication. Sometimes the credential is locked. Maybe it's lost even. So at other times, we need an alternative proof. In this particular case, we tend to call it identity proofing. Other organizations might have other names for it, but in the security community, that act of identity proofing is your ability to establish through other means outside of this credential that you believe you truly know who you're communicating with. Too often we just take people's word for it, and suddenly you have fraudsters coming in and resetting credentials because there was inadequate proof of who the identity was. So here again we have terms, visual, I see you, I know who you are, therefore I'll reset your credential, or a driver's license, something like that could be visual. But we also have cognitive questions. The problem with cognitive questions is if people are accurate, it ends up being information that could have been Googled or found out on Facebook. And if they're not your factual answers to the questions, nobody can remember what they stored in the database anyway. So what's becoming more popular for this identity proofing is out-of-band. An example of out-of-band, the more out-of-band you get with the current communication channel, that's what we call out-of-band. Most popular, I'd say, is your cell phone. being able to have previously stored a legitimate cell phone number on file so that if you need some kind of a reset, that could be sent to you outside the current communication channel. Keep in mind when we're identity proofing, it never should constitute that actual authentication process. It's simply used to reset the credential. Why this is important is the authentication typically kicks off another process called authorization of where you can go, and then accounting so that we know what was happening while that person was connected to the network. If in fact someone's able to do identity proofing and substitute for authentication, they skip outside of that whole realm of a process flow. So identity proofing, just a temporary reset that if it doesn't get used in quick order, well then it's locked again. But if it is used, it's only to establish that the real user can reset their credential. Within this realm of credentials, the credential typically locked out is the old classic password, something a user knows. This is the weakest form of authentication because it's so easily shared or guessed. Stronger yet is when it's something a user possesses, like an identity card, the common access credential known as CAC, or some other type of smart card. We've got lots of dumb cards too, picture badges, that maybe could fall into this category, but we really want some level of intelligence behind the second credential. It could be a key. It's something that they can literally hold in their hand. Now, it didn't have to be in their hand. If it was a digital certificate, it could be a soft copy on the computer. But then again, it gets into something that could be shared. So for the most robust category 2 would be that it was something they could truly hold in their hand, keeping separate from their computer or other device they're using as a means to connect. And then finally is our most robust model, something that the user does or is. Now the does is a new takeoff on this idea of biometric. Does would be things like speaking, and unfortunately that could be faked. So of the type 1, 2, and 3 of our different factors for credentials, while the biometric is considered the most robust, the best biometric is literally something the user is, like the fingerprint, the iris scan, or retina scan. While something the user knows, I mentioned, is the weakest, within the realm of a password or passphrase, length is the best credential or best characteristic that we have going for us, especially given that people should be changing this something they know every 30 days. So your PIN phrases that we use would actually be your weakest just because they tend to be 4 or 5 characters. Passphrases where you're getting into at least more than 15, which usually makes people want to vomit when they're an end user being told that's how long it has to be. But 15 is because it breaks the classic paradigm and it stays ahead of the technology curve as to what our attackers are capable of doing brute force attacks on with all their parallel computing. So 15 or longer, knowing you can get into 30 with a lot of systems, and then stepping back to realize some web still require that you only have an 8-character password, which is kind of going backwards. But within the idea of how many characters you're allowed, you want absolutely the longest password that you can possibly have. And again, this is where people are going to forget it. So if you can make it a phrase such as, finally, beautiful weather in June instead of March. Now swap out some letters to make it not real dictionary words so that you're breaking patterns. Patterns are always easy to crack. Somebody came up with a good 75, well actually I think it was closer to a couple of 100-character phrase, but it was a quote out of a book. Therefore it was a perfect pattern that could be Googled and it cracked in pretty short order. So while we're shooting for length, you don't want these classic patterns of real dictionary words. Then you've got something pretty robust. The second thing I want to stress with passwords, while we claim that they're not the most strengthening feature that you could have for a credential, don't get rid of a password if it's what you have. If what you currently use is a password, add a second factor to it. Truly, when we say strong authentication, it's a buzz phrase for 2 or 3-factor authentication. So by adding in something like a smart card or even a house key, well, a key to whatever is your environment, that's going to be your second factor such that now you have strong authentication. So while our second factor is inherently stronger than the first, to give you strong authentication, we really want one out of several categories. There's another area where people will falter. They'll say, oh, well, I have two-factor authentication because I have a fingerprint and a retina scan. Well, actually, those are two credentials, but they're not two factors. If I can defeat your biometric technology, I've still defeated you. Therefore, the goal with strong authentication is one factor out of different categories, such as one out of type 1 and one out of type 2. And with your type 3, again, that could provide for a three-factor authentication or be a second factor. Of course, it could be the single factor as well. All depends on what your scenario is. When we do biometrics, this tends to be for localized access. We don't tend to submit our biometric across a long-distance channel. We don't actually record your thumbprint or your iris scan. What we record are statistics about it. That's why there's an enrollment period where you are scanned over and over and over, and then all of the details are analyzed and summarized so that we can come up with a set of characteristics regardless of what position your thumb or finger happens to be at the time we try to actually enlist your details so that we can provide access control. So as far as where biometric tends to be utilized, it would be at a console of a machine so that you could get onto that machine, or it would be room access control. But we don't tend to use this for a distance, like a point-to-point protocol where we're coming over a remote channel. So within the realm of what kind of credential do you want to choose, you have to figure out what's appropriate. This goes back to the age-old adage that security is an inconvenience. Security is going to cost money. It takes investment of training your people, getting everything established, and there's going to be constraints on what amount of that financial overhead is available for this process. So keep in mind, do you have distributed servers? Are you going to be able to manage a public key infrastructure to have the credentials? Are you going to be able to properly age, to track everything, to provide for the revocation list with these classic type 2 being a digital certificate, and the biometric being the most important, not just for, or not most important, the most expensive, not just for buying the technology, but supplying the technology at each entrance place where you think you need to provide this control. There will be the enrollment period. There will be, again, the protection, the management, a possible bottleneck as people are trying to get in for the day. So there is no single cure when we talk security. That's one of the most frustrating things for the end users, for the end audiences. They want to be told, do A, B, C, and you've got a panacea. It will work for you every time. You're going to have a secure environment. But there is no single solution. Everyone has different amounts of criticality, sensitivity, and they're going to need to come up with their own unique solution. So by learning what your choices are, what the methods are, well, then you can make an intelligent choice. Keep in mind for the passwords, even though they're the weakest form, if you teach your people to have 15 characters or longer, if you make sure that you're storing them in a robust fashion, then you're still going to have a viable means, depending on your sensitivity and criticality of the services you supply. So as we are storing passwords, what we never do is store them as reversible encryption. If someone came along and broke that encryption method, they've got all the keys to the kingdom. Plus they have actual passwords. That's going to give them insight into how people think and possibly reveal a whole bunch of their other passwords as well, especially given people's preference to reuse passwords, use personal information, hobbies, jersey numbers when they were in high school. Even though we have this aspect of dictionary attacks, most dictionaries aren't a Webster dictionary. They're usually socially engineered. Let me see if I can shoulder surf the PIN code number that you enter into your phone. Let me see if I know your wedding date, birth dates of children. All of this tends to go into people's passwords. So by teaching your people to come up with a robust password in the first place, and then following that with proper storage, which is a hash table, Now people get upset with hash tables saying, yeah, but we have collisions. You can only have so many unique hashes because a hash is a fixed length output from whatever went in. However, the proper use for storing passwords isn't simply to hash them. It's to add something called salt. Salt is a dynamic random character string that is added before you hash the password. The salt should be securely stored as well. And in today's technology, it should be stored separately from the actual hash table, so that if one is compromised, the other isn't necessarily compromised. But it makes it much more hard or much more difficult for someone to come up with what the collision is when you're integrating additional content that is only stored there in that database when someone's actively trying to authenticate. So yes, we want passwords hashed because they are not reversible. Even if someone defeated it, they only have a representation of the password. Let's say I come up with a collision. My word has the same hash as your word. I'll never know that my word was your password. Now, passwords tend to be short, so there's a high probability it is your password. But again, if you encourage people to get the longer passphrases, even that's going to be less likely. But now you add salt on top of it, well, now you have a good environment for collision resistance. These websites being compromised on the cloud are because they're storing clear text passwords. The next step is, well, they're storing them hashed, but they didn't understand the need to use salt. And furthermore, many of them are using bad hashes like MD5. We have much more mature hashes like Haval or SHA-3. The next step, if you wanted to add one more level of protection on top, is to perform multiple rounds of hashing. Another possibility is to store more than one hash and make sure that both hashes agree. Now keep in mind, having more hashes, taking more rounds of hashing, each one of these are going to slow down the process and cause you delays. And that's what security does. Security is an inconvenience. It is going to add overhead to the environment. So you have to balance the right amount of overhead with whatever your concerns are for making sure it's the right individual. Again, recall with hash, very important, especially to teach our programmers. We tend to teach our network security providers, and yet we don't get it into the programmers that are making these applications to go out as web services. We need to not just hash passwords, we need to add in appropriate salt. While we still have the MD5 hash often used, we need to move away from it. Even SHA-1 is considered weak. SHA-3 just awarded recently. However, recently is an arbitrary word in the security world. Even though it's been around for a while now, I haven't yet seen SHA-3 devices, SHA-3 functions readily available. So no, you can use SHA-2, you can use Haval, you can use RIPE-MD. There are many hash functions out there to help you stay away from MD5 and SHA-1. Kerberos is known for single sign-on. Very, very old, written for a cross-platform. The intent of the Kerberos server was to provide an environment where the user only had to authenticate one time. And if it's only one time, then by golly, that credential should be really robust. They should be able to remember one password well. But truly, when it was incorporated, there was no question as to whether people belonged on the network. We were back in the government-owned government was all there was for the network. If you were on the network, it was because you were supposed to be on the network. As you, in fact, authenticated, you submit a session key for the day that was already encrypted with what was a pre-shared key. It gives you a ticket granting that permits you to ask permission to use a service. If you're allowed, you receive which you then supply to the resource. Furthermore, you can communicate with remote domains that you have a trust built up with. You have to authenticate to your current domain, but you're able to access resources from any domain that you have permission or trust set up with. There were lots of single points of failure with Kerberos. If, in fact, you took down the KDC, nobody could do anything. And if that person's credential were compromised, well, again, Someone had access to everything that individual had access to. Now take this Kerberos up to a higher level. Well, Kerberos was primarily used in the United States. Europe used a similar model known as Sesame. Now we've moved into federated logins. Whether you were a company scattered across the globe or not, Kerberos meant within an organization, as does Sesame. When we're talking about across organizations, this is when we use the concept of federated logins. So while a person's compromised credential could have allowed the hacker to get to any services that person had access rights to, when we're talking a federated login, compromise of that credential provides the individual access to every organization that they have been entrusted with. Again, now it's not just the fact of the person's access being compromised, but an organization's reputation for permitting that compromise to occur is going to be in question. This whole CAC, established according to the Personal Identity Verification Standard, which is an international standard, was developed according to the plan of having a smart card be able to be a federated login. So more and more we're moving into this federated concept along with our cloud services and our need to cooperate with other organizations for total services that we want access to. This is a huge issue. Kerberos itself is a strong conveyor belt. Kerberos says nothing about strong authentication. And I realize that this is a place where I hold difference with certainly some other professionals that I communicate with. Not necessarily in the security arena, but in other forms of vendor-specific products. Vendors can report Kerberos' strong authentication, and it's just a misnomer. It is a very robust conveyor belt. However, it's going to be the credential that establishes whether it's a strong authentication system or not. And Kerberos doesn't dictate in any form or fashion what kind of credential is required. So keep in mind it's a piece of the overall process. But if we use a very simple CHAP login with a password that's 8 characters or less, this is not strong authentication. And it's really going to bite us badly when we move into the federated arena. So, great conveyor belt. To have strong authentication passed across a clear text channel, that's not very good either. So the fact that it's a good, robust conveyor belt is important, but don't alleviate the need to consider what's the appropriate credential. The true benefit of Kerberos as it was developed was the third leg of the 3 processes we go through. It was the communication to the resource. What the Kerberos server is handing out with all of these tickets are unique encryption keys. The intent at one level was sure you only had to authenticate one time, but remember I never questioned whether you belonged on the network with Kerberos. The real benefit was that every single conversation in the network was uniquely encrypted from everybody else, so there wouldn't be eavesdropping going on. Well, that relies on your Kerberos server having a very large number of keys that it's capable of giving out. We call that the key space. So as we talk Kerberos, you really want to be thinking, where can it go bad? And it can go bad when people don't understand its intent. They don't provide it with a large key space, and it keeps giving out everybody the same key anyway, so everyone can eavesdrop on one another's conversations. It can also go bad if you don't protect that KDC, and someone could compromise it. Then we have AAA servers. The intent of the AAA server is that once you authenticate, that's not the end of the story. Now I want to authorize where you can go. So by returning these attribute value pairs, which is simply a variable name and a value, I can constrain you. I can say, okay, the variable VLAN will be this value. There's the VLAN you're going. The variable default printer will be this guy. There's the only guy you're allowed to print to. So everything about the authorization of your environment is what the AAA server is bringing back to you. And I tell people in the security arena, our most important acronym to know is CYA, Protect Thyself. That's what accounting is all about. It's making sure that you have a record of what all was done while this individual was connected to the network. Now the new buzzword getting tied in here a lot is NAC, Network Access Control. We used to call this sheep dip because you used to dip the sheep before you would shear them to get all the bugs and varmints off. The idea of sheep dip was to prevent anyone from connecting if their patches weren't up to date, if their anti-malware definitions weren't up to date. And that's where NAC first started being utilized, was to provide a context-sensitive control. So in its early integration, it was NAC AA. But today, our NAC servers are getting so much more comprehensive, they're actually integrating with the AAA servers themselves. Keep in mind with our AAA server, a deficiency that we had was there was no protection from the remote access client to that network itself. Early on with AAA servers, we were talking radius, remote access dial-in users, and all the discussion, who's better, radius or TACACS? What part of the conversation gets encrypted? Well, that was all between the AAA client, which is the connectivity device, and the AAA server. The expectation was the network client was coming over a dedicated line, and that isn't happening anymore. So very much for today's world, we have to focus on this PPP from point to point. How are the credentials, how is all of the conversation being supplied to get that network client into this environment? So again, so far we have that we want good credentials. We have that we could use a Kerberos server for a single sign-on. We could integrate that into a AAA environment so that we have tight authorization over where you can go. But we still need to protect that conversation. Understand, as that network client is allowed in, they can go anywhere they want on the network that they've been authorized. But we've got to protect that first leg of the network where it's a de facto network, if you want, or an extension of the network. That channel reaching out to the network client is increasingly coming across airwaves with Wi-Fi or coming across unprotected internet channels. I've mentioned this point-to-point protocol authentication. It's a means of establishing that from my point to that point of your network, I want to feel like I'm part of your network. So from this point to that point, how will we communicate? It's one of our more popular layer 2 authentication or communication protocols. So what has evolved as far as authentication supported underneath of PPP is what you see here on the screen, PAP, CHAP, and EAP. PAP was clear text passwords, early used in radius, dial-up bulletin boards, absolutely inappropriate as we started getting to a networked environment. So then we moved to CHAP, a challenge handshake, where a clear text challenge is sent, the user hashes it, basically treating it like salt. So now you can't capture the hash of the password and do a rainbow attack. You're going to have an ever-changing reply. And the server knows what the password should be, therefore they can refuse or OK them into the network. The problem is this will always be a dictionary crackable method. And the reason is because we want to use security by standards. That's an important feature. Doing security by obscurity by itself leads to all kinds of situations that will easily be defeated. When we are adhering to security by standards, it means that we listen to the cryptographers and we step up to the models they dictate appropriate for today's communication. And CHAP has been passed by a long time ago because of being dictionary crackable. If I know the mechanism that you're using here for performing your hash and I can capture this handshake, all I have to do is put my feet up at home and try every word in my dictionary. When I get the hash reply that you get, I have defeated your whole login process. The only time today that CHAP is a viable method is when it's a one-time password, something like what might be provided with an RSA token. Then I really don't care if you crack it because I'm never going to use it again. So understand what we mean by this aspect of CHAP being insufficient for everyday logins when people are using a static password. This is the whole reason why EAP was developed. Extensible Authentication Protocol is a framework wherein you can develop and support one-factor, two-factor, three-factor authentication, plus it's happening at layer 2. February 1980, as the IEEE was saying, we need to come up with a family of bridging specs so that we can intercommunicate regardless of who the vendor is, and they created the 802 family of specifications. 802.3 being Ethernet, 802.5 token ring, 802.11 Wi-Fi. Anytime you see 802.1, it pertains to all of the 802 families. And that's where EAP fits in, to, at layer 2, mandate that no one can communicate until after they've authenticated. This is why we call it port-based security or port-based authentication. There's basically 2 logical ports provided to every physical connection, be it physical through the airwaves or physical through a wired connection. And then what happens is one is controlled and one is uncontrolled in reference to the end user. And to begin with, the only port that's open is the uncontrolled, meaning they have no control over the network. The only protocol that can transport over the uncontrolled channel is EAP. And it isn't until the EAP authentication succeeds, the controlled channel opens up, and now they can communicate on the network. The beauty is they can't talk, they also can't listen. There's none of that running into the switch closet to pull cables because you have unknown people coming into your conference room and you want to make sure there's no chance they plug into the network. With layer 2 authentication, known as 802.1x EAP, it is impossible. But remember, this authentication then must be followed with an appropriate layer of encryption, or someone still could take over that communication channel. So this port that we're referring to is actually referring to the port they're plugging into at layer 2, not the ports we normally think of at layer 4 for our communication channels. So as EAP, again, it's an extensible authentication protocol. Here's how it occurs in between the end user and the AAA server. Now the form that came out originally, although expensive, as the flagship model is EAP TLS. Mutual authentication with digital certificates, that's why it's expensive. And a lot of supervision to make sure the certificates are up to date because the person isn't on the network yet. They can't check a certificate revocation list. But the network client makes a request to the AAA client of, hey, I'd like to connect. They receive the digital certificate from the AAA server through which they can now build a tunnel. The most popular EAP that is established in the enterprise today is EAP-PEEP. Everyone's used to CHAP. It's already built into our mechanism. With EAP-PEEP, we only have a digital certificate on the AAA server used to make the tunnel. Now the person can go ahead and perform CHAP authentication inside that tunnel because no one can sniff it. They won't see it. They can't do the dictionary attack anymore. EAP-FAST is functionally very similar to EAP TLS. It's a Cisco proprietary version that uses their own internal certificate creation tool. It's called PACS, Personal Access Credential. So you don't have the expense of digital certificates, but you still have the benefits of this asymmetric encryption, the strength of it. Don't take a panacea with EAP either. There is definitely bad EAP. EAP MD5 was never even released because it's just sending across a bad hash, MD5, plus it's just the hash of the password. That would be subject to a rainbow attack. And early on, in an attempt to make use of EAP so the common person could easily grab hold of it, make use of it, Cisco came up with lightweight EAP, or EAP-LEAP, as a means to try to make their Wi-Fi encryption more robust. It was following this EAP authentication with WEP, rather than just stepping into WEP without any authentication happening first. So LEAP was in fact authentication, but then it would be followed with encryption. The problem with lightweight EAP is the way they made it lightweight is they kicked it off with CHAP. Therefore, it was subject to that dictionary handshake, which Joshua Wright demonstrated when he wrote the tool called Asleep. We've been talking about following with appropriate encryption, and in all cases that will be symmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption is strong, it's fast, it's the idea of all the years of building and communicating. We've come up with some fantastic ciphers. We have one key, it's known as that secret key or a private key because if anybody found out about it, it would undermine the whole process. The problem was key delivery. How did you get the key to the other side? And it was always an out-of-band problem. You got to sneaker net it. It's your problem. But once you get the key, we have really strong encryption. Also, because of the key distribution, we ended up holding on to keys for too long. Well, stale keys lead to greater possibilities somebody cracks them. So that wasn't so good. But as long as it's a good, fresh key, Symmetric will always be our strongest, fastest encryption available. Asymmetric was created to cure that key distribution problem. Diffie-Hellman, said to be the fathers of this whole process. These have evolved. Diffie-Hellman was actually an ability to exchange a key or derive a key across an untrusted environment. But what they created evolved into a whole family of asymmetric ciphers like RSA, El-Gamal, ECC. And in all these other cases, we actually have two related keys, a private and a public. If someone saw the private key, they could use it immediately to calculate the public. So again, we use that word private because it would undermine the whole thing. However, if someone sees the public key, they don't know anything. So this becomes something that is publicly distributable. When we make use of these together, you could encrypt with either key, but the opposite key has to be used to open up whatever you encrypted. And what we found is we have different benefits depending on which key we encrypt with. The end result of asymmetric isn't that we've supplanted symmetric with asymmetric, it's that we've combined both of them together. So we have digital envelopes, which is that secure delivery of the symmetric key. That was the whole reason for making it. But we also have digital signatures and digital certificates. Again, that digital envelope is where you encrypted with the receiver's public key, that symmetric key, and you know you have confidentiality because it's going to take their private key in order to open it. So you could spam it to the whole world. This is exactly what you use when you're making your SSL connection to your bank. Digital signatures are the opposite. We are going to encrypt with our private key, unique unto us, so that the whole world can open it with our public key, demonstrating factually that we did use our private key to encrypt it with. Absolutely no confidentiality, however, suddenly we have non-repudiation. Finally, digital certificates. Provided by an independent certificate authority by definition, it is providing us with authenticity. Not authenticity of you because you're holding this digital certificate because it's a public document. Anybody could be holding anybody's digital certificate. It's the authenticity that the public key inside belongs to the individual described in the metadata. So the digital certificate is a certified copy of your public key with all this metadata, such as who is the individual that it's been assigned to. And at the bottom is the digital signature of the certificate authority, confirming that they believe that this public key goes to one and only one individual. So again, that digital envelope is what we do most outside of symmetric encryption, is to get the symmetric key to the other side. I will encrypt with somebody's public key, that symmetric key, and I don't care who sees it because it will only be the recipient with their private key that can open it up. When can somebody else get in is if the key's compromised. That's why we have the revocation list. Or if you didn't use a very good cipher, which would be shame on you. Then we have the digital signature. I want this aspect of non-repudiation, but asymmetric is very slow to process, so I don't want to encrypt the entire document. Instead, I'll take the hash. The output of that is a message digest, and it will be the hash that I encrypt with my private key. That way, not only do you have the non-repudiation that it came from me when you open it with your public key, but when you can take the hash yourself and it compares to my hash, you know it has its integrity. So digital signatures give us two things, integrity and non-repudiation. For both digital signatures and digital envelopes, we also have authenticity, providing someone took the time to confirm that digital certificate before making use of it. So the basis of everything about this depends upon having a public key infrastructure that can be trusted and people managing their keys appropriately. Again, that digital certificate is a certified copy of someone's public key, and it's what we use all over the place, particularly in SSL, TLS, and Secure MIME. We have Pgp MIME using Pgp certificates. The big difference with Pgp is everybody signs their own. There is no third-party trust like the CA. So if you're actually communicating with somebody, you know them, PGP has the same strength of algorithm, it just doesn't have that independent trust and an easy way to provide for the revocation. I say easy, but if people never bother to check, well then that wasn't so easy either. Within the PKI, the only non-negotiable part is that certificate authority. They're the only ones that can create digital certificates, and they're who publish the CRL. And for separation of duty, you can have an optional front end called a registration authority who provides for applications, processing, making sure they have all of the proof of someone's identity before they actually tell the CA to make the certificate. There has to be the repository wherein we're going to store these. While the highest level of integrity is when an end user makes their own key pair, most end users wouldn't know what you're talking about. So in general, PKIs actually generate the key pairs themselves, and they really have to protect those private keys in some type of a legal escrow, so not just anybody can get out to them. And you also want to make sure that you have some kind of out-of-band channel through which you can securely deliver that private key to them. Then you need the key recovery server for maybe someone's computer was damaged. They don't think their key is compromised, but they need to set up a new machine. So all of these go into a lot of effort that someone has to make in order to set up a PKI. This is why we have public authorities like VeriSign, Thought, GoDaddy, or we have private authorities. Anyone can be an authority if they buy the software. So it's important that we protect that trust list inside our browser, which is where everybody's identified that is recognized as a legitimate trusted root certificate. If end users can start modifying this, well again, things go down the tubes. It is a hierarchical structure or a single root authority that you can have. If you buy out another company, you can create a bridge of trust where you kind of incorporate their CA as well. Or if with another company you're going to come up with some kind of a strategic plan to move forward and work together, you may want to perform a cross-certification so that at a technical level you've already authorized that you're going to recognize each other's certificates as valid. That would be your cross-certification. Recognize the life cycle of a key or a key pair that is involved in this whole PKI infrastructure is not the period of validity for which time frame we're going to use a key. Within that metadata, it's not just who is the person that this public key belongs to. It's certainly who is the CA who created this. It's also the validity period, not valid before, not valid after. That's considered the lifetime of when that key pair is allowed to be utilized for new purposes, like new digital signatures or new files that I'm creating. And at the point that it says, you know, this is the expiration date, that's the death of the certificate. The whole reason for having a CRL is to remove it from circulation before it expires, for reasons such as maybe superseded with a later version, or maybe they moved as a military person to a new base, or maybe they're allowed to sign on behalf of a company and not themselves anymore. That would be a superseded. Certainly if the key was compromised, or maybe they don't work there anymore, cessation of operation. That's why it would go on the CRL list. So you have 4 reasons why something is dead. Either because it expired, that's it, or when everything about the certificate looks valid, that's when you would check the CRL for the other 3 reasons that it might need to be removed from circulation. Now consider that, sure, it's dead, but you have a whole bunch of files encrypted and we're within the 5-year window that you're liable for e-discovery even though the person doesn't work for you anymore. You have to be able to get into those files. So the life cycle is beyond the expiration date, all the way to when you never have to worry about proving something that was digitally signed anymore or something that was encrypted. At that point, you need to flush it out of your entire key store. Anything that you hold on to is overhead. It's costly. So you keep it for the entire period of time that you're required to, and then you flush things away. I invite you to attend more of our courses where you can learn more in depth on this content, but thank you very much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to present this to you. Do know that you can chalk up your continuing education points. And if you have all these certs, you can use this for each one of them as long as it falls into the domain for which they allow you to have the points. And for all the listed here, these webinars count. Thank you again.